Hey everyone, it's Charlene. Today I'm going to show you several different ways to use embossing powder. We're starting out here with the Celebrate background stamp. You guys know I love a good background stamp, so we'll put this here in our stamp wheel right over the top of an A2 sized card. Lift it up and flip it over. Next, we'll cover the entire stamp with clear embossing ink, and before we flip this over, I'm going to add some anti-static powder tool, flip over our stamp, and make sure to press down really well over the top of the stamp. I'm going to stamp one more time just to make sure that I get a really good coverage with my embossing ink. Again, flip over the plate and press down over the entire top of the stamp. Next, I'll bring in clear embossing powder, carefully pick up my panel, and cover the entire panel with the clear embossing powder. Give it a good tap to remove any excess powder. Once my heat tool's heated, I'm going to come along and melt all of the embossing powder by slowly running my heat tool all the way across the card panel. If you're working with a full card panel like this, I suggest placing it on some type of heat-resistant surface so that way you don't burn your fingers or mess up any of your embossing powder when you are melting it. Take your time, and as soon as the powder turns shiny, that's when you know you want to move your heat tool on to the next section. Once all of your embossing powder is melted, you're going to see it's nice and shiny all the way across the top of your card panel. Now I'll ink blend all the way across the image using yellow, mint, and blue ink, and I'm going to do this on the diagonal. You can see I'm starting by getting ink on my brush, and then I slowly work my way onto the paper in a circular motion. Once I have about a third of the card panel covered with the yellow, then I'll come in with my mint. And the embossing powder is melted, so it's acting as a resist. So none of the ink that's going over these areas that have been heat embossed is going to go through to the cardstock. You get this nice, fun, bright pop of white out from underneath the ink colors. Once I have the second third covered with the mint, I'm going to lastly come in with my blue ink. Once I'm finished with the ink blending, I can come in with a microfiber cloth and just wipe off any of the excess ink that might be sitting on top of the embossing powder. Now, I changed my mind and I did a new panel, this time with blue and a different shade of mint because I preferred how this looked with the remaining pieces of the card. But I didn't manage to record it. Next, I'm using the Lovely Layers party hat as well as the coordinating stencil. I'll come in with my blue ink and color a piece of cardstock that's going to be large enough to fit my party hat. Once I'm finished, I'm going to dry everything with a heat tool so I can move on to the next step. You want to make sure your cardstock is dry because you'll put embossing powder on top and you don't want it to stick to any wet ink. Once completely dry, I'll generously apply some anti-static powder tool. Then I can bring in my chosen stencil shape. I'm going to use the polka dots, so I'll put this right over on top of the blue color. Then to add my embossing ink, I recommend using some type of foam tool. It makes it a lot easier to get down into all of those little openings and get good coverage with your embossing ink on the cardstock. Once finished, I'll pull up the stencil and then add my embossing powder on top. Gently tap the cardstock to remove any excess. And if I have spots like this where it kind of went over the edges of the stencil, I use a dry paintbrush in order to wipe those away. I'm going to make sure that my heat tool is nice and hot before I come in and start melting the embossing powder. This embossing powder is really fun because it has a gorgeous metallic shine to it. Once it's cool, I'm going to come back in with the coordinating party hat die and I'll cut out this cute little hat. Next, I'm going to come in with the other layers of the base of our party hat to prep everything. You have several different options with this set. I might not use all of these, but I'm going to go ahead and cut all of them out. Another thing you could do with embossing powder is you can heat emboss over an entire die cut. So I've cut out all the little layers that are going to make up our bottom border of the party hat as well as the top, and I'm going to alternate here between silver, white, and then silver, white, silver, white. And I did skip this one little layer because I wanted there to be 4 layers and be equal. All you're going to do is come in with your embossing ink and you will cover the entire die cut with that ink. Make sure to get it nice and saturated. If you don't have a tool like this, you also could take the pad of embossing ink and smoosh it down directly onto the die cut. Now that I have these inked up, I'm going to move them over to the dry part of my paper that doesn't have any embossing ink on it. Bring in my embossing powder and cover all of these die cuts with the embossing powder. You can use tweezers to move the pieces around and make sure they get nice and covered by all of the powder. Then once you're done, carefully pick them up. You'll tap off the excess powder and then use your heat tool again to melt all of your embossing powder. Once you've done one side, you're going to want to switch to the other side with your tweezers. Then you can just re-dip that area in a tiny bit of embossing powder. Then you won't have any white marks where your tweezers were. Bring back in your heat tool and go ahead and melt that little part there. Now we have a pretty shiny embellishment. When you return your embossing powder to the container, make sure to turn your paper so that you're not running it over on the side that has all of that embossing ink still sitting on there. Otherwise, it'll stick all over on that side. Now we can layer up our pieces. I do recommend just adding glue to the center. That way you can pop up the edges of these pom-poms if you want to, and then you can make them look more 3D. So we'll layer this white piece onto our silver piece, layer this silver piece onto our white piece, and then layer each of these little white pieces onto the centers of our silver pieces. When you're finished, go ahead and put an acrylic block on top. That way the glue can dry and get a nice strong bond. Now I'll move on to the top of my party hat. Switch the acrylic block onto the top of the hat and attach this long piece to the base of my party hat. I'm going to run my glue right here all the way along the bottom of my party hat. Get that lined up so that it looks nice. Press down. That looks really good. And then do the same thing with our top piece. I'll add the glue to the top of the party hat, add the top, and then go ahead and press down. Look at that nice and shiny piece. Next, I'm going to use the party blower dies as well as the coordinating stencil. I'll start with the main blower part of the stencil here, and I'm going to color in all of these areas with the same blue that we used for the party hat so it coordinates. Once those are colored in, I'll go ahead and make sure my paper is nice and dry because again, we're going to be doing some more heat embossing. I'll come in with my anti-static powder tool, make sure to get a nice and good coating there. Now I can come in with the coordinating stencil. I'm going to use this top portion that has the small dots, and I'm going to put clear embossing ink on those 3 pieces. Now, you do want to be careful that you don't go through over onto the other section of the stencil. So I'm going to add a little piece of masking tape so that I can be extra safe. Come in with your embossing ink and smush through the stencil right onto the cardstock underneath there. You want to start with the one that's at the top because then you're going to move your stencil up and on to the next piece. Again, adding some clear embossing ink through there, pick it up and move it on to the last piece. Add our embossing ink on top of this one. Now remove the stencil and we'll add our silver embossing powder. You can remove those extra spots with your dry paintbrush if you want to. I'm not terribly worried, but I do want to save that extra bit of embossing powder because it is so pretty. Come in and melt it all with my heat tool, and once again we'll get that beautiful, fun, shiny detail. using the coordinating dies to cut out all of the pieces, and I'll layer them up with my liquid glue. Here's our first piece, our second piece, and here's our third. For my sentiment, I'm going to use the big, bold birthday stamps and coordinating dies. I'm not sure which one I want to use at this point, so I'm going to stamp out both of these. I'll ink them up with some intense black ink, just making sure to get a really nice coating of ink all over the stamps so I'll get a very nice impression. Flip my plate over and I'm going to lightly press down because I don't want to lose the detail of the line work. Instead, I'll just come back in and do a second stamping, ink my stamps a second time, put my plate down and gently press. Now lift. I'll cut them out using the coordinating die cuts. I decided this piece needs a little bit more contrast, so I'm actually going to go ahead and clip off what we did in the blue for the bottom layer. I've die cut an extra bottom layer in white, and now we'll get a little bit more contrast for the blower piece. I've decided on my sentiment, and I did cut out a couple extra of the die cuts, so that way I can layer all of these up with some liquid glue. After I've applied the glue to the first layer, I just set the next layer on top, add glue to this layer, same thing the next layer. Now I can add my final layer, remove my tweezers, and go ahead and lightly press all the way around the edges to line everything up. Now you have a stacked piece. It's going to add a lot of nice dimension to the front of the card and be very sturdy. I'm going to trim down my piece by 1/4 of an inch on each side. That way when I put it onto the card panel, I'll get a nice white border all the way around my finished card. The last way we're going to heat emboss is with traditional stamping with a sentiment. These are the mini messages Sassy Birthday. There are coordinating dies. These work with the mini messages dies, but I'm going to stamp one of these directly on the inside of my card. They're fun and kind of a little snarky. Things like, "From afar, you look 21. So glad you'll always be older than me." I think we tend to overlook heat embossing on the inside of a card with a sentiment, and I think that will look really nice with this. I've chosen the "You're Still Older Than Me" sentiment. I have it lined up using my cover sheet here from one of my sticky mats, and now I can stamp this with my clear embossing ink. Again, anti-static powder tool. Now the clear embossing ink. And since these are fine lines, again, I'm going to just lightly press on the stamp and do it twice. That way I can make sure to get enough embossing ink on there for the powder to stick. Now add the silver embossing powder and then tap it off. Come in with a hot heat tool and finish off my sentiment. There we go. Now we have that nice shiny sentiment on the inside of the card to match. To help our front sentiment stand out more, I'm actually going to add vellum. I'll adhere it to about half of this card panel. That way when the sentiment is on top, it stands out a lot more. I'll do this by adding a piece of double-sided adhesive sheet to the back of the vellum. That will make it so there are no glue lines. Now I have my adhesive sheet here. I will peel off the backing, add it to my vellum, and you'll see this is going to cover that area. Now I can trim around this with my scissors. I've trimmed it down. I can go ahead and remove the backing from the adhesive. This is very sticky, so be careful when you're working with adhesive sheets like this one. I'll line it up where I want it to be and take it across the whole portion. Now I can go ahead and trim off the excess from around the edges just using my non-stick scissors. Now you can see there's no glue lines, but it'll make our sentiment show up much better on this very beautiful but busy background. Next, I can put together the remainder of the card. I'll start by gluing this piece here to our background piece, and I'll lay it down so that about 1/4 of an inch is showing all the way around on each side. I went ahead and figured where I'll place everything, so I'll glue the sentiment down here. I'll adhere this right along the edge of the vellum piece and press. And now I can glue down the party blower. I've added foam tape to the back of the hat. I haven't stuck it down yet. I just have it there so I can figure out placement for where to put everything. Next, I'll adhere the party hat. I'm going to put this at an angle so that way it creates a triangle between the sentiment, the blower, and the party hat. There we go. Now I can add the entire piece onto my card base. I like to line up the corners with each side of the card base so that way I can just flip it over and lightly push around the edges with my fingers to make sure that it's all lined up nice and neat. Lastly, I'm coming in with the Let's Party gem stickers to add a little bit of bling to the centers of all of our little pom-poms. Then I can come in and fold up some of the edges of those pom-poms, and that's going to give them a really nice 3D look. And here's our finished card, really pretty with all of that shine from our embossing powder, the different blues and mint colors, really love it. I hope you picked up some tips and tricks today on how to use embossing powder in your cards going forward. Please be sure to like and subscribe as well as hit that notification bell so that I can continue to bring you more crafty content in the future. Until next time, happy crafting!